Hello, welcome back to the Fractional Typology Project. My name is Tita Koshi. Uh, we're reviewing Coraline, and this is part two. To redeliver my second disclaimer from the first part, if you're not 18 years old or older, you should leave. I'm talking about adult subject matter that should not be consumed by anyone younger than 18. So, this video is not for kids. So, going from what I was saying about the nature of the other mother, the creations of the other mother are neatly divided. I'm talking about the way that the Coraline pulls punches as a movie. Let me reset my timer here. And, I've talked about how the other mother goes purely mask off, which is unlike a regular predator. That the other mother completely neglects her victims in a way that doesn't create pros and cons for the victim facing a more neglectful environment outside of their abuse. And the third way is that the creations of the other mother are neatly divided in terms of how you're supposed to conceptualize them emotionally. Those that follow orders from the other mother, like the piano, the mice, the plants, the insects, and praying mantis car. Those that do their own thing, like the bat dogs and the intertwined actresses, and those that care, the other father and other YB. That is easier to emotionally disentangle. I mentioned in the first video, it's like, what if other father and other YB were more sociopathic? But that is more horrifying because it's enough of a reveal to reveal that the other mother's care is entirely fake, and that produces itself a certain amount of dread that is for most kids and families sufficient. Um, Somewhat to the degree that you portray the negative dynamics of this kind of predatory nature is to the degree that you um, even in simulation create them and then abet them, which is not like really true, but it's also, I don't know, it's participating in a very harmful thing. And so the Coraline is a very well made story that hints at something much darker. And I feel like as someone that's trying to get in at the truth of people and of characters, um, I feel a responsibility to talk about the ways in which the movie is pulling its punches on the shape of a real predator. So, um, easier to emotionally disentangle when those are neatly divided. I think about like the best friend in the Truman Show. Maybe his name was Marlin. I don't really remember. But this thing of like, oh, I would never lie to you. It's like the way that subordinates that you would think because they're not the leader could be sympathetic. And the other father and other YB are like a reassuring force that even in this world they're not trying to fundamentally harm Coraline. And there's an end to the lies very quickly. Like the lie is actually very brittle in Coraline. The other mother is like, "Oh, we love you," and then it's like, "No, not really," and it's like, "Ah, shoot." And so, that's not how it is, in a more predatory dynamic. And the fine delineation of who supports who and why in terms of the other mother's creations helps to make that dynamic easier to emotionally disentangle for. It helps that we can feel bad for the other father and for other YB, but then wholly condemn the other mother. It makes the dynamic easier to sort out and easier to disentangle from, which a real predatory relationship is designed in the opposite way. That makes emotional disentanglement much harder. The only one that tries to hook into Coraline is Rat Bobinski, and things are so visibly bad that his offer doesn't register as true, just rubbing salt in the wound. And later I clarify that it's really just dwelling on the absurdity. It's like, oh, you could be here and we could give you joy forever. It's like, you think I'm gonna believe that after this horrifying display that I've been through for the last week? I don't even know how long her parents were gone. you know. So, talking about Mr. Bobinski, I believe Bobinski is an eccentric man who wants to be exceptional. He does acrobatics in the open. He eats beets to be strong. He trains his mice to be amazing. He is less interested in the accolades of others than what is amazing to himself. And I think that I could see the interpretation that he wears his Chernobyl liquidator medal as a source of pride, for being one of the people that took action in that tragedy. Um, I think that's central to what Bobinski values. I struggled to say this in the index cards, but there's a way that Bobinski is painted that reminds me of like Rolf from Ed, and Nettie. Like he has a live chicken in his apartment. He's hanging his clothes, which that is a thing in older apartments. It can be, but like at the same time, um, he's got a pot that's boiling, probably of beets and stuff. Like there's a certain like rustic, disorganized, I don't know, thing that's going on with Bobinski that is tough to put into words and tough I think to track like culturally where that comes from. Like Bobinski is clearly Russian, right? And the the fact that it's like, oh, he's drunk, is an illusion that Mel, that the mom concludes. It's like, I don't know what's going on there. What's going on there on a cultural level? I don't know. I just thought I'd mention that. Just as like trying to figure out that variable. I don't really know what to, I don't know. I don't know what to conclude there, but both Spink and Forcible are theatrical and love theater. The drama and comedy mask Doorknocker, the theater superstition Matt for whistling, calling her dogs, they're barking infernal yapping. They live in theatricality, bickering yet dependent on each other. And I included that dependent thing um, largely colored by the intertwined nature of their sort of horror actress things later. And I later reflect on the idea that maybe they just did that for like the visual horror twist of like, oh, they're taffy, they're intertwined taffy flavors. Um, I don't know. I don't know how much like dependence is a thing that's sort of implied. It's like they're a theater duo that's been together for like the longest time, but is that dependence or is that just a good friendship? I comment later on like the fact that I think that their friendship is nice. Forcible is much more invested in being the best. Spink is warm, caring, yet superstitious. She's also more savvy, while Forcible is more dramatic and delusional. But later, Forcible is right, so going a little far when I say that. It's sweet that despite all their conflicts, Spink and Forcible can remain friends. I think it's sweet. I think the cat is sensitive and sentimental, takes being called a wusspuss very seriously. Other Mother starts with the other label to build normalcy, then moves to better to emphasize quality for meeting needs, then silences her with a strawberry to build compliance to her instructions. The fact that a silenced Wybe is to Coraline's liking is interesting and incomplete. Other Wybe isn't just quiet, he's genuinely attuned to Coraline's needs, in a way that the real Wybe is not. Not to say that Wybe doesn't care, but other Wybe does. It's Wybe's social obliviousness that prevents him from seeing the parts of Coraline that she's sensitive about, that he could care about, that other Wybe does care about. Other Wybe redirects when she asks about his pain. points up at the approaching mice circus blimp that flies into Mr. Bobinski's apartment. Either a strategic decision to keep other mother happy or self-neglect for Coraline's sake. It's messed up in retrospect how much uh, rolling and abuse that kid's eye slash soul goes through in the movie, in the mouse performance. The fact that the mouse ball is that kid's soul, and the fact that the mouse rolls on it so much and does so many different tricks and so much rolling and bouncing or whatever, it's messed up. It's pretty bad. The gloves that call to Coraline happen to be the most expensive ones. 24 versus 15. Like, you look at the prices on the table, and the gloves are the most expensive ones. Which makes sense why Mel is like, no, we can't do that. No. Mel does wish that Coraline felt better. Mel does seem to feel pretty bad. Coraline thinks her parents don't care about her or know her. She doesn't understand their money troubles. They might try to hide that from her for her sake, so that she doesn't have to feel that as part of her identity. Coraline seems sad that she offended the cat. When the cat, showcases how seriously they took Whispus, Coraline immediately is like, "No, I didn't mean to say that. You come back." It's interesting. I commented on the One Piece 4 through 8 how, like, it's sad that a dog can't voice their grief. And I think that animals have a certain level of emotionality and expression that if they could just speak English, that there would be a lot more apologies and accommodation. Morbidly, I think about Snowball coming in and talking to Summer about his balls, about them removing his testicles in that Rick and Morty episode. I don't know. The cat does impossible movements through the real world and the other mother's world. So, like, at the end of the movie, in the real world, the cat goes through the signpost, which it serves to showcase that the cat's nature is not a thing that's restricted to the other world. But in the other world, they do the same thing on a log, where they go straight through into nothing, and then pop out of a hole that they can't have popped out of, and then go into a hole and then come out of another hole in a way that splits their body into two. So the cat's magic. Like, there's no way around that. The cat's definitely magic. Some sort of magical being. Now this is me quoting the cat to talk about this thing that I kind of disagree with. The cat says she wants something to love, I think. Something that isn't her. Or maybe she just loves something to eat. I think it's telling that the cat walks back the idea of love. Or maybe she just wants something to eat. The idea of something that isn't her, I think, is true too. There's a sort of exhaustion with the things that she creates and the sort of, like, want for a human soul. But notice how there's no valuing of that human soul. Like, her predation is purely instrumental and monstrous. And I think that it barely hints at the love thing, but then follows through on it not at all. And I think it really could. I think it really could go exactly there. I think in a real dynamic where this is portrayed more realistically, I think it would go there. But there's a much bigger question with it. I later invoke Makima from Chainsaw Man, and I think that I haven't watched Chainsaw Man yet. That's in this 30-year-long series that I'm doing. But there's this thing where Makima values Chainsaw Man, but not Denji, and then it's like, to what degree is care even possible? And I feel like that question is participated in more than it is in this, because it's like, to the degree that the question could be brought up, it's immediately pushed away for how that would muddle the dynamic of something that is supposed to be just straight monstrous. Which is better for the pacing of the movie, better for the sort of experience of them as a monster that you win over, but then worse for the expression of a predator, which I, get into in later in this. One important distinction: the other mother is not part of the consuming mother archetype, because she is not a because she is not attached to Coraline. She discards the ghost children. No attachment. She is an instrumental predator that is only looking for Coraline for what she can provide to her. It's purely instrumental. Purely to use basically Coraline's soul. It's not even using a particular thing that Coraline produces. It's just being able to completely take Coraline and take her over and have her as basically her doll. She gives Coraline a doll, and then she makes Coraline into her doll, and it's sort of a complete lack of control and agency. And then if the ghost children or anything can go by, complete and utter neglect. So it's not good, not a good arrangement. Very predatory, very monstrous, and not at all participating in attachment and love, even though it's like themed around that with her mother role. She never truly steps into it, which is important for classifying the other mother in like this thing of predation in the guise of love, and also classifying that against the wider range of dependency and abuse that can be in that dynamic. This is a quote from the other mother. They say even the proudest spirit can be broken with love. The goal is to break with love. What the other mother is looking for is compliance. Not actual love, not anything involving attachment or involving attachment, but just compliance to what she wants. She is grooming Coraline, creating dependence on her to fulfill her needs, dependence on the other mother. She's love bombing Coraline, showering her in gifts, then expecting and coercing compliance, creating helplessness. Though I'm not that familiar with it yet, I would make a parallel to Makima from Chainsaw Man, grooming her victim, Denji, for instrumental purposes, which is getting in at the Chainsaw Man. Neither care for their victims, just what they can get out of them. The other mother does everything for Coraline to sell. No. The other mother does everything for Coraline to sell over her soul. But, as I said earlier, to keep things kid-friendly, there are ways she holds back. Which are the ways that, the movie pulls the punches that I mentioned earlier. It's interesting how individual nuance clouds the frame of being a victim. It's harder to differentiate the ghost children. To do so would be a distraction from their story role, yet their individuality has been washed out by tragedy. So I was thinking about the ghost children and the fact that, my whole thing here is doing personality analysis. I'm like, oh, what's the difference between the ghost children? Who are each of them individually? And the answer is that they are victims. Victims that miss their moms, that have been, have had their individuality washed out, have had their hope and their love and their souls washed out by the other mother. But that's not explicit that their individuality has been wiped out. They're clearly visually different enough to delineate their time periods, enough to isolate, Miss Lovat's twin as Miss Lovat's twin. But beyond that, they're not given any personality or characterization, and that's because that would conflict from the emotional purpose of the scene. But it's interesting how, in that sense, to properly portray them being victims, that it's a pacing issue to let them be more than that, to let them sort of have their own individuality and stake. And that's just an interesting thing. That's interesting that you have to pick that compromise. And it's one thing for a predator to be not represented accurately because they are sort of portrayed in this more monstrous light, but it's another thing to have the state of a personal tragedy wash away who you are. I don't know. It's a weird thing. But it's sad that as the beldam isolates Coraline to the mirror, her parents are gone, so her isolation never ends. You know, like the beldam basically says, like, you'll stay in here and you'll stay in here alone until you learn to act better. And then she does, end up alone, because even as she escapes the beldam, thanks to other Wybe, her parents aren't there. So ever since the beldam said that, she just has to endure all of it alone, which sucks. Um, Forcible was right about lost things. Spink isn't always the savvy one. The little like eye lens thing that they use to look at the shape of the souls or whatever, the color. Forcible is right on that. So originally it's like, oh, Forcible is dramatic or whatever, but sometimes Forcible's right, sometimes Spink is right, whatever. To salt the wound, the first glimpse of her mother after the long isolation is the beldam pretending. So, it's like she's been isolated for, a week or more without her parents and having no contact or love. And then the first thing is like, the beldam pretending to be her mother. Um, a more malicious version of the beldam would take advantage of that. It's like complete isolation from your parents. And it's like, it won't be that bad. If you put on the button, like, I'll be your mom. And I won't give you all this different dreams and stuff. It'll just be us. And I'll love you. And I'll love you for real. Unlike your mother or whatever. And that would have been much darker and more malicious, and I think much more like a predator in a way that the movie doesn't dip into. Um, so, yeah. The movie, therefore, shows predators exist, but pulls its punches when it comes to all of what they do to keep their victims. Which is for the best, because it's for kids, but just to showcase that the beldam is made more manageable. She's got a thing for games, which is something that the Black Cat says about the beldam. Witches and demons love wagers and contracts, and games are the kid-friendly version of that phenomenon. Um, just occurred to me that the door was sealed shut for years and had to be ripped open. Like the door to the beldam was, they had to take the button key. Mel took the button key and like ripped open the whole door. So the door was like purposefully hidden, which I think is, you know, that's a meaningful thing to note. And then a digression that I wrote here. There is no such thing, in my view, as a good or necessary tragedy. To invoke Diane Nguyen from BoJack Horseman, all the damage she got isn't good damage, it's just damage. A predator, like the other mother, does serious harm that affects a person in multiple lasting ways. The triumph in winning or escape is limited. What matters then is rebuilding something healthy and meaningful. Neil Gaiman said in his masterclass that I happened to watch that he wrote Coraline to show kids that dragons can be beaten. And to put a damper on that, and also put it in perspective, it's just all deeply bad to be in the web of someone like this. It's worth stopping someone bad so it doesn't happen to someone else, but revenge does not heal what was burnt. The best thing is for the door to stay locked, the key inaccessible at the bottom of the well. Exactly what the predator doesn't want. You know, the movie frames the defeat of the other mother as a sort of triumphant moment of going back to something that isn't the predator. And I think that can be a nice and healing message, but I also think it's not as true to the lived experience of this kind of emotional abuse. Um, but nonetheless, it's comforting and designed with fundamental gratitude and support networks in mind. I think the hard thing is that people don't always have, or very frequently don't have, the kind of support networks that Coraline leans on after her, experience with the beldam is said and done. I think that that's the darker thing, is that people end up feeling neglected and not understood, and then end up falling in with predators, and then even if they manage to get themselves out of that dynamic, they don't have a good place to go to, because the neglect that caused them to seek out the predator is the same neglect that they end up going back to, which is what Bobinski hints at. And with Rat Bobinski, it's an absurdity, but in real life, it's a much darker thing, which I think is part of why people find comfort in this movie, because it talks about gratitude, and it talks about love, and it talks about that sort of thing. And I guess I wish that the world wasn't so lonely, so people could feel that more. So, also, the cat invokes love. So does Coraline. But love is a varied thing, of which the other mother has very little overlap. You have a funny way of showing it, Coraline says after the other mother says that she loves her. The other mother doesn't love Coraline. She doesn't even value her at all. The other mother agrees to basically an impossible task, finding the three eyes and then also finding her parents. Like, she's not going to do that. But assistants, the pliers, the eye lens, the flashlight, the bats, the dog bats, the cat, all of those things make the impossible possible. I don't know how much the intertwining of the actresses is intended symbolism, or if it's just the visual of taffy plus creepy, which is, I mentioned that earlier. Not only is Bobinski's offer salt in the wound, I think it more so drives home the absurdity that she would never get that. Never get that sort of genuine care that he's offering. Again, the opposite of what a predator would do. Because a real predator would, offer that sort of tantalizing dynamic and then actually attempt to offer it. The decaying wallpaper is simultaneously mask off to the decay, but also the loss of power from the eye/soul removal. Hopefully I've talked about how the eyes seem more like souls to me, which I remember doing that. The ending is very much a dramatic villain monster defeat. Her behavior is more monstrous to make defeating/escaping her more satisfying. It definitely isn't. She only starts to beg after she's already slamming on the door, and her begging is like bad. No emotional hooks, no effort whatsoever. It's just like, don't leave me, I'm gonna die. No. Like she's done nothing to make herself sympathetic. She was only cruel, which, if someone is participating in a manipulative, unhealthy dynamic, they're not gonna do it that cleanly. Which I've said that a billion times, so you get it. The center of it all, the center of all of the other mother's world is a web. She is a spider and a luring predator, and an instrumental one that doesn't care whatsoever, which I feel like I've demonstrated. Something about angel children rejoicing that Coraline is still alive is odd to me. So, and not to invoke necessarily like Christian Christian themes explicitly, but like I don't know, the dogs are angels, right? The dogs are dressed up as angels, and the kids are clearly angels. Like, they have halos and everything. And the it's strange to me that the kids are free and their souls are free, but then they're like, you're still alive, you're still living. It's like, if you are in, I guess, everlasting life and that sort of like freedom, then why would you think being on this planet is like the thing to value. It's like we think of, I think there's this conceptualization of death as tragedy because a person loses their ability to live their life. And in that vein, it makes sense that the kids would be like that. But the kids are not only ghosts, but they're also angels that recognize that death was a mere transition for them. And in that vein, it's like, what exactly are they mourning? But I'm probably nitpicking by even talking about that, so whatever. The conclusion of Coraline feels to me interestingly coincidental. At the same time that the Beldam's mask comes off, Mel buys her the gloves. Wybie uses her real name. In the last scene when Wybie helps her out, Wybie calls her Coraline, and Coraline's eyes light up, her face lights up, and it's sort of a symbolic thing of like finally coming to understand her. And it's like, well, textually speaking, like just reasonably, like Wybie understood that Coraline was struggling with something real, but that doesn't mean that the traits that defined their initial interaction would suddenly change. It's like, when did Wybie find out her real name? So the symbolism is there, but like as soon as the predator is gone, her environment is much more supportive. It's like Mel is like, I hate the mud, but you were right. The tulips are very nice. And it's like, that's sweet. That's very sweet. It just sucks that like people don't get to have that. Because a lot of times people will come out of something like deeply damaging, and then the world doesn't slow down at all. The world barely accommodates the degree to which you underwent that tragedy, and then moves on anyway, because it's just another day for so many people. And I think the film does a very good job of expressing that early, but then for the sake of like gratitude and togetherness, it expresses this thing. And it just sucks that real world support networks don't come together that collaboratively to help people feel understood. It's very much a thing where the movie ends with this sort of gratitude of like, oh, Coraline um, gets to be understood and gets to be loved and cared for who she is. And you grow sympathetic with the characters that you've spent the film with, for the ways that they, in their own way, grow to understand you. But that's a good gratitude to have. It's just complicated the way that the world doesn't always play out that way, and how you learn to feel okay with yourself and feel understood anyway. You know, it's just hard. I think the gratitude and love that is central to Coraline is genuinely central to something beautiful, and I think that is a lot of why people really value the movie, is because the movie embraces that in a way that, if people are looking at, a dynamic in their life where they don't feel understood, it's a very healing movie that way. Um, so I think that's why people love it. But, you know, it's a great movie. It's a great movie. To talk about these elements, I'm just trying to be like honest about the ways that I think life is compared to this sort of fictional archetypal representation. To talk about, how things are. And it's interesting. But the positivity of this sort of like firm villainous defeat coupled with that genuine appreciation is a thing that I think people find reassuring for good reason. A darker, more real version of this movie might prove Rat Bobinski right, that even as she avoids this predator, the world remains neglectful of what is alive in her. Some people have to endure that until they find people who care. And the world can be lonely. Americans seem to struggle deeply with loneliness. Coraline finds gratitude in the people around her, especially after her harrowing experiences. And they make that easier for her by acknowledging her, giving her attention and credit. I think another movie where this was done maybe more realistically was Lady Bird, where Lady Bird realizes that the grass isn't always greener, and for all her flaws, her mother loved her. The sad thing is, in the real world variations of this story, there isn't always the support network waiting for the victim. which I think is in part why so many people love this movie, because it gives support and gratitude when people don't always feel cared for and understood. That's it. Those are my full thoughts on Coraline. So I hope you've enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.